Hello, my name's Kevin Ling, and this is one of a series of videos called Geopolitics for Busy People. And the topic of this video is resources, power, and global conflict. Now, when we talk about conflicts, we're talking about territory, we're talking about resources, we're talking about spheres of influence. And when we're talking about countries in conflict, we're not talking about ordinary people. We're talking about elite decision makers, the people who say they represent countries. Most people want peace. Here, when we talk about countries, we're talking about political leaders. We're talking about military officials and corporate executives. These are the people who drive conflict. So the question really is, who benefits from conflict? When we look at conflict, we have to look at something called the military-industrial complex. This is a conjunction, a complex of the government, the military, and arms manufacturers. The military-industrial complex. This was a phrase coined by President Eisenhower of the United States in a warning that he gave in 1961. He warned about the power of the military-industrial complex, referring to government, military, arms manufacturers working together to profit from arms sales and defense contracts. This complex prioritizes war preparation over diplomacy. Now, when you talk about war preparation, you're talking about supply chains. You're talking about corporations working together to supply government with arms, with the arms manufacturing. But these supply chains become more important than public needs, than welfare, than education, hospitals, health services, and so on. So, why does this system exist? Why does the military-industrial complex have so much power over decision-making in government and power over decisions about conflict? The question is, why does the system exist? So here we have to talk about the economic engine of this system, and that is resources. Corporations, big corporations, need raw materials for their profits. Now, the critical resources are used in the energy sector, in technology, and in weapons. These critical resources are used in electronics, they're used in electric vehicles, in satellites, in computers, and in the manufacture of weapons. And there is competition over access to these resources, competition between the big powers in the world, the United States, Europe, China, Russia, and so on. The biggest resources, the most important resources in this struggle are oil and gas. But of course we have many more: lithium, cobalt, rare earths, copper, nickel, graphite. So, this results in a competition over resources, and that leads to territorial conflict. Conflict over the territory where these resources are accessible. The profit motive drives this expansion. The profit motive drives this competition for these resources. Now, resources alone are not enough to lead countries into conflict. We're also talking about spheres of influence. Influence over the territory where these resources can be found. So let's look at spheres of influence. So countries and blocks of countries want to have political and economic spheres of influence. Again, when we're talking about countries, we're talking about the elite decision makers. They want economic control beyond the borders of their country. They want to protect supply chains beyond the border of their country, for example in the Middle East and in South America. and they want to secure trade routes beyond their borders. So this means they want to expand their sphere of influence into territories beyond their borders. This, of course, leads to tensions. It leads to the need to protect the sphere of influence, and this leads to conflict with the territories into which these spheres of influence expand. It's all about access to profits. And expansion is always strategic. It's always in the interests of the big corporations who need the critical resources, the oil, the gas, and so on. They need these critical resources driven by the profit motive. The expansion is not random. So we have to ask the question, who dominates this system? Who dominates this system of expanding spheres of influence? When we talk about spheres of influence, we can use the United States as a clear case study. The United States is dominated by corporate power. Of course, when I say the United States, I'm talking about the elites of that country. Corporate power is in the hands of the big corporations which dominate the economy of the United States. We're talking about ExxonMobil, Chevron, Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, Tesla, General Motors. What is the motive that drives these big corporations? Well, the motive is creating profits. Profits for their shareholders. Profits for their shareholders means continuous, relentless corporate expansion. Expansion into territories where they can get access to more resources, where they can extract resources cheaply. The cheaper the resources are, the larger the profits for the shareholders. Now, corporate interests in the United States dominate foreign policy. Why? It's because these corporations have so much influence over their government. Influence through lobbying, influence through campaign donations. That means many of the people working in the American government are in the pockets of these corporations. In this way, the corporate goals create the foreign policy of the United States. The foreign policy of the United States always has to align with corporate goals. Now, these corporations have a lot of tools of influence, and the American government working for the corporations have a lot of tools of influence. So let's go through these. One tool is trade agreements. Now, trade agreements created and designed by rich countries are always for the benefit of the rich countries. Trade agreements can be mutually beneficial, or they can be a tool of leverage over countries with which the agreements are made, allowing the rich corporations of the United States to put pressure on poor countries to give access to their resources. Another tool of influence is sanctions. Now, this is obviously enforcing compliance, because if a country does not agree to open its borders or to open its economy to American investment, to the investment of the big corporations, then sanctions can be imposed as a kind of punishment for not going along with the plan or the whole corporate power expansion of sphere of influence. Another tool which the corporations can use is the banks, the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. They can give loans to poorer countries with many harsh conditions. The conditions are usually to allow the big corporations to extract the raw materials and the resources from these countries cheaply. Now, there are, of course, covert tools of influence. For example, CIA operations designed to bring about regime change. Now, the United States government can create regime change if the regime in the country does not allow access for the corporations. The other tool of influence is, of course, the military force. The United States has 800 military bases globally. Now, the military force is also created through NATO alliances. The United States dominates NATO decisions, and these decisions can create strategic leverage over areas where the United States wants to have access to resources and where the United States wants to extend its sphere of influence. NATO is a military alliance designed largely to extend the sphere of influence of the United States. So let's look at two case studies. The Iraq War between 2003 to 2011. This was a war about access to oil reserves, corporate access to oil reserves. Also, it was a war about spheres of influence. The United States government wanted to position itself strategically in this area. And then the war in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. Again, a war about having influence over the region. A war about access to minerals and resources in the region. So what do these case studies, and there are many more, teach us about conflict overall? One conclusion which should be clear is that conflicts are often linked to resources and spheres of influence. In other words, to governments trying to get access to resources and trying to expand their spheres of influence. Now here, of course, when I say countries, I mean the elite decision makers in the governments, in the military-industrial complex. We're not talking about ordinary people. Now, what benefits these elites? War benefits. The profits for the shareholders benefits these elites. For this reason, we should always question the official narratives. When I say official narratives, I'm talking about the mainstream media, because the elites, in many cases, control the media narratives that we hear. So we should always support diplomacy and ask our governments to support diplomacy. We should support peace movements, because these peace movements question the narratives from the warmongers who often make the decisions in our governments. We should always ask for prioritizing welfare over warfare. And we should always think critically about what we're hearing on the mainstream media about conflicts and find ways to challenge these narratives, which prioritize warfare. We should prioritize welfare over warfare.